Caleb Richardson had worked his entire life to achieve this moment. After years of grinding, saving, and sacrificing, he had finally done it, bought his dream home in a quiet, upscale neighborhood in Oak Ridge Estates, Tennessee. The house was a beautiful two-story brick home with a wraparound porch and a spacious backyard, exactly what he had envisioned for his future. He had pictured peace, friendly neighbors, and a fresh start. From the moment his moving truck pulled into the driveway, Caleb could feel something was off. He noticed the curtains twitching, eyes peering out from windows, and neighbors watching from their porches a little too long. But nobody approached him. No friendly introductions, no welcome baskets, just silence. At first, he brushed it off, thinking maybe it was just a reserved community. The first sign that wouldn't happen came the very next morning. Caleb had just brewed his first cup of coffee in his new home when he heard a sharp knock at the door. He wasn't expecting visitors, but when he opened it, there she was. A woman in her mid-60s stood on his porch, dressed in a perfectly pressed beige burls, pearl earrings, and a gold HOA emblem pinned to her cardigan. Her posture was stiff, her lips pursed, her eyes calculating. "Good morning," she said, her voice clipped and precise. "I'm Margaret Holloway, president of the Oak Ridge Estates Homeowners Association." Caleb extended a hand, offering a polite smile. "Nice to meet you," he started, but she cut him off quickly. "I know who you are," she said flatly, barely glancing at his hand. Instead, her eyes flicked over his shoulder, scanning his house like she was taking inventory. "I wanted to go over a few things." She handed him a thick stack of papers, stapled neatly in the corner. HOA guidelines covered everything from lawn maintenance rules to acceptable house colors. Caleb skimmed through the pages, noting the usual restrictions. Before he could say anything, Margaret cleared her throat. "We like to maintain a certain standard here," she said, her gaze drifting toward his moving truck still parked in the driveway. "I assume you'll have that removed by this evening." Caleb raised an eyebrow, already sensing the type of person he was dealing with. "It'll be gone when I'm done unpacking." Margaret nodded, but not in a satisfied way, more like she was making a mental note. "Good," she said curtly. Then, in a tone that barely concealed its edge, she added, "And just so you're aware, trash bins must be placed at the curb no earlier than 6 a.m. on collection day. I noticed yours were out last night." Caleb frowned, already feeling the irritation creeping in. "I didn't put them out," he replied evenly. "That must have been the previous owners." Margaret pursed her lips as if she wasn't entirely convinced. "I see," she said after a pause. "Well, in the future, please be mindful. We have rules for a reason." And just like that, she turned and walked away without another word. Caleb exhaled slowly as he shut the door, shaking his head. Maybe she was just overly strict. Some HOA presidents took their roles too seriously. But he wasn't going to let one uptight neighbor ruin his fresh start. At least that's what he told himself. The next few days made it clear Margaret wasn't just particular, she was watching him. The first warning notice appeared in his mailbox. Unauthorized vehicle in the driveway. His own car. Then came another letter about improper lawn maintenance. His grass had grown an inch, maybe two. By the end of the week, Caleb had collected a stack of official notices, each one nitpicking at something minor. The porch light is too bright. The front hedge isn't trimmed to HOA specifications. The mailbox is a 1/4 inch off standard height. Still, he kept his cool. Maybe she was like this with everyone. Maybe if he just followed the rules, she'd back off. That hope vanished the moment he took an evening walk. As he passed by a group of neighbors chatting in a driveway, the conversation abruptly stopped. They all turned to him silent, assessing. One woman forced a tight smile, but no one else acknowledged his presence. And right in the middle of them stood Margaret, arms crossed, whispering something to the others. Caleb didn't need to hear the words to know exactly what was happening. This wasn't about HOA rules. This was about him. And if Margaret thought she could intimidate him into leaving, she was in for a surprise. The next morning, another letter. This time, it wasn't a notice, it was a formal warning. Bins must be retrieved within 1 hour of collection to preserve neighborhood aesthetics. Failure to comply will result in escalating fines. Caleb stared at the paper, irritation bubbling beneath the surface. He had retrieved his bins at the same time as his neighbors after work, but apparently that wasn't good enough. Curious, he decided to do a little test. The following morning, he woke up early and took a slow walk through the neighborhood. By 9 a.m., dozens of trash bins were still lined up along the curbs. Some weren't even fully closed, overflowing with garbage bags. Not a single violation notice. Only him. Caleb snapped a few pictures and sent a polite email to the HOA board, asking why his bins were an issue when everyone else's were ignored. No response. But 2 days later, Margaret was back on his doorstep. This time, she didn't knock. She just stood there, clipboard in hand, her sharp eyes locked on his. Caleb opened the door, leaning casually against the frame. "Something I can help you with?" Margaret didn't answer right away. Instead, she glanced past him into his home, like she was inspecting it from the doorway. Then she held up a form, her lips pursed in disapproval. "This is a formal request for you to submit proof of home ownership," she said smoothly. Caleb's stomach tightened slightly. "Proof of ownership?" he asked, his voice calm but edged with suspicion. Margaret's lips curled into something that was supposed to be a smile but had no warmth. "We've had complaints." "Complaints?" Caleb repeated, crossing his arms. Margaret nodded, her voice syrupy but sharp. "Neighbors have noticed unusual activity. Different cars coming and going. Furniture deliveries at odd hours. Some are concerned that you might be renting this property in violation of HOA regulations," she added, her tone deceptively sweet. Caleb let out a short, disbelieving laugh. "You're kidding." Margaret's expression didn't change. Caleb took a slow breath, forcing himself to stay calm. "First off, I own this house. Second, I've lived here for less than a month. I'm still moving in. That's why there have been deliveries." Margaret's grip tightened on her clipboard. "We have policies to ensure all homeowners are properly vetted. We'll need to verify your deed." Caleb knew exactly what this was. She hadn't asked any other neighbor for proof of ownership. Just him. Still, he kept his voice level. "You can pull the record yourself as public information." Margaret's eyes narrowed slightly, but she quickly recovered, her expression smoothing out. "I'd prefer if you submitted it directly." Caleb tilted his head, his patience thinning. "And if I don't?" Margaret's fake smile stretched. "Then I'll have no choice but to escalate the matter with the whole board." Caleb exhaled slowly, holding back the words sitting on the tip of his tongue. She wanted him to react. She wanted him to get angry, to give her an excuse to turn him into the problem. So he just smiled. "I'll think about it," he said, then closed the door in her face. Margaret didn't like that. That evening, as Caleb sat on his porch sipping a beer, he saw her again, standing at the end of his driveway, talking to a man in a polo shirt and khakis pointing at Caleb's house. Caleb didn't have to guess what was happening. Margaret wasn't just trying to intimidate him anymore. She was looking for a way to get rid of him. Caleb knew Margaret wasn't done with him, but he didn't expect her to strike so quickly. The next morning, as he walked out to check his mail, he saw a thick envelope stuffed into his mailbox. There was no HOA logo this time, just a return address from a law firm. Inside, he found an official complaint filed with the County Housing Authority, claiming that he was occupying the property under fraudulent ownership. For a moment, he just stared at the paper, his fingers tightening around it. Margaret had escalated from petty violations to trying to have him legally removed from his own home. The complaint alleged that Caleb had failed to submit proof of ownership and suggested he might be renting the property under false pretenses. No names, no actual proof, just assumptions dressed up as legal accusations. He let out a slow breath, his mind already running through the possibilities. This wasn't about proving anything. It was about exhausting him, drowning him in paperwork, and hoping he'd get so frustrated that he'd just walk away. But she had underestimated him. Caleb didn't back down from a fight, especially not one he knew he could win. That night, he made a call. "Hey, Joe," he said when the line picked up. "I need a favor." Joe Martinez had been Caleb's real estate attorney for years, sharp, relentless, and twice as ruthless as Margaret could ever hope to be. By morning, Joe had everything he needed, and Caleb was ready for the next move. 3 days later, the Oak Ridge Estates HOA held an emergency board meeting. The community center was packed, homeowners shifting uncomfortably in their seats, whispering among themselves. Everyone had heard the rumors. They knew something big was about to happen. Caleb sat near the front, arms crossed, watching as Margaret took her seat at the head of the long conference table. She looked calm, but Caleb saw the tightness in her jaw. The way she clutched her stack of papers just a little too hard. She was nervous. "Good." Margaret cleared her throat, lifting a printed document. "We are here to address the ongoing issue regarding Mr. Richardson's residence," she began, her voice steady. "Given the numerous violations and the concerns raised by our community members, I'd like to speak," Caleb interrupted, his voice calm but firm. Margaret's lips pressed together in a thin line. "You'll have a chance to respond after." "No," Caleb cut her off smoothly. "I'm speaking now." A murmur spread through the room. Margaret's expression flickered, but she forced herself to gesture stiffly for him to continue. Caleb stood and unfolded the first document from the stack he had brought. "This," he said, holding it up, "is the legal proof that I own my home, filed, recorded, and indisputable." Several people in the audience shifted uncomfortably as they realized the complaint against him had no legal standing. He placed the deed down, then pulled out another document. This, he continued, is a purchase agreement for another property, minus 214 Ochre Drive. Margaret's face barely changed, but Caleb saw the flicker of confusion in her eyes. Then he pulled out the final document. And this, he said, letting the words sink in, is the deed for 216 Acreage Drive, Margaret's house. The silence was deafening. Margaret's mouth parted slightly, but no sound came out. The woman who had spent weeks trying to evict him had just learned, in front of everyone, that her own house belonged to him and she hadn't even known it. A sharp intake of breath rippled through the crowd. "Wait," a voice murmured. "Did he just say?" Someone else gasped. Margaret's fingers twitched against the table, gripping the edges of her paper as if she could somehow rewrite reality. "That's impossible," she said, her voice lower now. Caleb tilted his head slightly, letting the weight of the moment settle in. "You might want to check the HOA records, Margaret. That foreclosure you ignored. The property sale that went through last month, I was the buyer." Someone in the back chuckled. A few of the board members glanced at one another, their discomfort palpable. Margaret's breathing had gone shallow, but she tried to keep control. "This doesn't change anything," she said sharply. "The matter at hand is it changes everything." Caleb cut in smoothly. "See, while you were busy sending me bogus violation letters, you forgot to pay off your own property debts. And when your house went up for auction, I was the highest bidder." A collective murmur of disbelief spread through the room. Margaret's face drained of color. Caleb wasn't done. He placed another document on the table. "Now, let's talk about fraudulent eviction attempts," he said, his voice sharp. Margaret's head snapped up. "Excuse me." Caleb tapped the legal complaint she had filed. "You reported me as an illegal occupant. You claimed I had no right to live in my home." He let the words hang for a moment before locking eyes with her. "Would you care to explain why?" Margaret's fingers curled into fists, but she kept her voice even. "As I stated in my report, several residents expressed concerns." "Who?" Caleb asked simply. Margaret's jaw tightened. "I am not at liberty to disclose no names," Caleb interrupted, raising an eyebrow. "That's funny because I spoke to several neighbors before this meeting. None of them recall expressing concerns." A few murmurs stirred in the crowd. Homeowners exchanged glances, some shifting in their seats. The tension in the room shifted. It wasn't just between Caleb and Margaret anymore. People were starting to see it. Margaret opened her mouth, but Caleb continued before she could recover. "You accused me of violating HOA policies, yet you've repeatedly ignored other violations in this community." He pulled out a stack of printed emails. "I filed formal complaints about broken shutters, overgrown lawns, trash bins left out for days. None of them resulted in violation notices." He turned to the rest of the board. "Tell me, do these rules only apply when Margaret feels like enforcing them?" Stephen Reynolds, the HOA vice president, cleared his throat, looking uneasy. "I think we should take a moment to." "No," Caleb said sharply, eyes still locked on Margaret. "Because this isn't about HOA rules. It never was. This was about her deciding who she thinks belongs here." A sharp murmur rippled through the crowd. Margaret's lips parted, panic flashing across her face. For the first time, she wasn't just being challenged, she was being exposed. A voice from the back of the room broke through. "This is a disgrace," an older man muttered. Caleb turned to see Mr. Holloway, one of the longest-standing residents of the neighborhood. He shook his head, looking straight at Margaret. "You really tried to evict the wrong guy." A few scattered chuckles echoed through the room. The shift was happening, but Caleb wasn't done yet. He placed his final document on the table. "And one more thing, Margaret," he said, his voice casual but firm. "You're behind on your HOA fees." Margaret's head snapped up. "That's a lie." Caleb tapped the paper. "I bought your house at auction, remember? That includes the debt attached to it. You owe the HOA over $3,000 in unpaid fines and fees." The room erupted. Margaret had lost. Margaret stormed out of the HOA meeting, her face pale with barely contained rage. The silence she left behind was thick, a mix of shock and disbelief hanging in the air. The board members exchanged uneasy glances, realizing they had hitched themselves to the wrong person. Caleb didn't move, just leaned back in his chair, arms crossed, watching as the neighborhood's so-called queen lost her crown. Slowly, the murmurs in the room began. Did he really just say he owns her house? Someone whispered. She tried to evict the wrong guy. Another chuckled. The tension cracked, giving way to a shift that Margaret had never seen coming. People were finally seeing through her. Stephen Reynolds, still seated at the board's table, cleared his throat and adjusted his tie. "I think it's safe to say this situation was mishandled." Caleb let out a short laugh, shaking his head at the ridiculous understatement. mishandled. Margaret tried to have me thrown out of my own house, and you all went along with it. Lisa Hendricks, a middle-aged woman who lived 3 houses down, hesitated before speaking. I don't know what to say, she admitted, her voice careful. I had no idea she was doing all this. Caleb arched an eyebrow, letting the weight of her words settle. Didn't you? Lisa opened her mouth, but no words came out. The truth was, the neighbors had watched Margaret harass him for weeks, yet none of them had spoken up. Now that she had fallen, they were suddenly pretending they hadn't noticed. Guilt was settling in, but guilt wasn't an apology. Caleb turned back to the board. Since we're still here, let's discuss actual HOA violations, he said smoothly. Stephen straightened, adjusting his glasses as if trying to regain control. Like what? He asked, already looking uncomfortable. Caleb pulled out his list of documented infractions, the same one Margaret had ignored. Broken fences, trash bins left out for days, lawns that haven't been mowed in weeks. All of these exist right now, yet somehow I was the only one receiving fines. Lisa shifted in her seat, looking around as if noticing for the first time how many of her own neighbors had violations that had conveniently gone unchecked. Stephen glanced at the list and at the other board members, some of whom now looked visibly uneasy. They knew Caleb was right. We'll review these complaints properly, Stephen said, his voice careful. Caleb gave a slow nod. Good. And while you're at it, I'd like to file a formal complaint against Margaret Holloway for harassment, falsifying HOA complaints, and attempting to misuse her authority for personal grievances. A fresh wave of murmurs rippled through the room. Lisa hesitated. Do we even have the authority to do that? Stephen let out a slow breath, rubbing his temple. The board can vote for removal if an HOA officer is found abusing their position, he admitted. Caleb leaned forward, his voice calm but unyielding, then put it to a vote. Lisa hesitated for only a moment before nodding, seconded. One by one, hands started going up around the room. Margaret's allies, the people who had always backed her, looked around in uncertainty, realizing they no longer had the support they thought they did. Caleb watched as the people who had once stood by silently now voted to strip Margaret of her title. It was ironic. If she had just left him alone, she'd still be HOA president. But her own arrogance had been her downfall. A few minutes later, Stephen cleared his throat and announced the decision. By majority vote, Margaret Holloway is officially removed as president of the Oak Ridge Estates HOA effective immediately. There was the final nail in her coffin. Caleb sat back, watching the stunned expressions of those who had never imagined a day without Margaret ruling over them. The neighborhood had changed, whether they were ready for it or not. 2 days later, Caleb spotted Margaret standing at the edge of his driveway. This time she wasn't alone. Her husband, Richard, a stiff, rigid-looking man in his early 70s, stood beside her with an unreadable expression. Caleb exhaled slowly, setting his beer down on the porch railing. Something I can help you with. Margaret's voice was tight, controlled. I want to discuss the sale of my home. Caleb had expected this. The thought of renting from him must have been unbearable for her. I'm not selling, he said simply. Margaret's jaw clenched, her hands tightening at her sides. I've lived in that house for 32 years. Caleb tilted his head slightly. And yet, you never paid off the debt attached to it. Richard cleared his throat, shifting uncomfortably. We're prepared to offer you a fair price. Caleb leaned back against the railing, eyeing them carefully. Define fair. Margaret's lips thinned. The same amount you paid at auction. Caleb let out a short, amused laugh. That's not how real estate works. You lost your house because of unpaid fees, and I legally purchased it. If you want it back, you'll have to buy it at market value. Margaret's hands balled into fists. That's ridiculous, she snapped. You're just trying to make a profit off of me. Caleb's expression hardened, his voice turning cool. No, Margaret. I'm treating you exactly how you treated me. Silence stretched between them, heavy with the weight of her own hypocrisy. For weeks, she had weaponized rules and regulations against him, convinced that she held all the power. But now, she stood in front of the very person she had tried to destroy, completely powerless. Richard sighed, rubbing a hand over his face. How much? Caleb glanced toward the house, pretending to consider. Given the location, the current market, and your unpaid fees, $450,000. Margaret's face twisted in fury. That's outrageous. Caleb shrugged, his voice casual. Then I guess you'll have to find somewhere else to live. For the first time, true panic flickered across her face. This was real now. She wasn't just being removed from the HOA board, she was losing her home. Richard exhaled sharply, clearly realizing they had no leverage. We'll consider it. Caleb nodded. Take your time. A month later, a for sale sign went up in front of 216 Oak Ridge Drive. Margaret had refused to buy back the house at Caleb's price, and no bank would give her a loan for the amount she needed. She and Richard packed up and left in the middle of the night, moving to a smaller home across town. The neighborhood changed after that. Without Margaret in charge, the HOA actually started working the way it was supposed to. They focused on real issues instead of policing nonsense. Some neighbors still avoided eye contact with Caleb, embarrassed by their silence, but others made an effort. One day, Lisa Hendricks walked up his driveway carrying a plate of cookies. "I know it's late," she said, shifting awkwardly, "but welcome to the neighborhood." Caleb smirked, accepting the plate. "Took you long enough." Lisa chuckled, looking a little sheepish. "Yeah, it did." Caleb took a bite of a cookie sweet. A little stale, but better late than never. Some people spent their lives trying to control others, convinced that power came from status, rules, and making others feel small. But real power, that came from knowing who you are and refusing to let anyone take that away from you. The neighborhood felt different without Margaret Holloway's presence looming over it. For the first time in years, Oak Ridge Estates wasn't ruled by a single person's whims, and the change was palpable. HOA meetings actually focused on real concerns. Neighbors no longer whispered in fear, and the atmosphere shifted from suffocating control to something that almost resembled a real community. But Caleb knew something that most of them didn't. Power, once taken, doesn't just disappear. It shifts. 2 months had passed since Margaret packed up and left without so much as a goodbye. Her former allies had been forced to adapt, and though some of them still shot Caleb cold glances, most of them had come around. Lisa Hendricks, who once hesitated to acknowledge the problem, now openly backed him in HOA meetings. Even Stephen Reynolds, the former vice president, had started listening instead of blindly enforcing outdated rules. Despite everything, Caleb wasn't naive. Margaret had ruled with an iron fist for over a decade, and systems like that didn't crumble overnight. Some people still resented him for being the one who brought her down, even if they secretly despised her. But Caleb didn't care about being liked. He had won, and he had no intention of letting the neighborhood fall back into the wrong hands. One evening, as he was relaxing on his porch, he saw the letter in his mailbox. The whole logo was printed at the top, but something about it felt off. Caleb took a sip of his beer, leaned back in his chair, and slowly opened it. The moment his eyes landed on the first line, he chuckled darkly. "Dear Mr. Richardson," the letter began, "the Oak Ridge Estates HOA is pleased to inform you that you have been nominated for the position of HOA president in the upcoming election." Caleb shook his head, letting out a low whistle. "You've got to be kidding me." He skimmed the rest of the letter, reading about the upcoming vote, the responsibilities of the position, and how homeowners had expressed confidence in his leadership. It was laughable. The same people who had let Margaret Harrison for weeks were now trying to hand him her throne. But Caleb wasn't sure if they wanted him to fix the system or just to absorb the blame if things went wrong. The next morning, Lisa Hendricks showed up at his door, a hopeful smile on her face. "I assume you got the letter?" she asked, not bothering with small talk. Caleb waved the paper in the air, leaning against the doorframe. "Yeah. And I assume you had something to do with this." Lisa shrugged but didn't deny it. "We need someone who actually cares about fairness. Someone who won't turn the HOA into their personal kingdom." Caleb chuckled. "You're asking me to take Margaret's old job?" Lisa's expression turned serious. "No, we're asking you to make sure no one else ever does." That gave Caleb pause. Caleb had never wanted to be part of the HOA, he had just wanted to be left alone. But he had learned the hard way that when you ignore power, someone else will take it and use it against you. If he declined, someone else, maybe another Margaret, just younger and quieter, would fill the void, and he wasn't about to let that happen. He folded his arms, watching Lisa carefully. "If I do this, there will be conditions." Lisa smirked. "I figured as much." Caleb exhaled slowly, thinking. "First," he said, "we rewrite the whole rule book. No more vague regulations that can be twisted whenever it's convenient." Lisa nodded. "Agreed." "Second," Caleb continued, "violations will actually apply to everyone, not just the people someone doesn't like." Lisa grinned. "I can live with that." "Third," Caleb added, "we eliminate the HOA's power to file legal complaints without concrete evidence." Lisa's eyebrows lifted slightly. "That one might take some work, but all right." Caleb held her gaze, his voice unwavering. "And last, this can't be about politics. The moment someone starts treating this position like a throne, I walk." Lisa gave him a small approving nod. Then it sounds like you just accepted the job. 2 weeks later, the HOA election was held, though it was barely a contest. Caleb won by a landslide with only a handful of people grumbling about it. When his name was officially announced, he couldn't help but smirk at the irony Margaret had spent years hoarding power, only to be replaced by the man she had tried to destroy. Stephen Reynolds, looking more relieved than disappointed, handed Caleb the official HOA documents. "I have a feeling you'll do things differently," he said, shaking Caleb's hand. "Damn right," Caleb replied, signing his name at the bottom of the first document. The first order of business, burning Margaret's legacy to the ground. Over the next few months, Caleb systematically dismantled every petty regulation she had used to control people. Gone were the nonsense fines, the arbitrary inspections, and the unspoken culture of fear. In their place, he put transparency, fairness, and rules that actually made sense. Some homeowners resisted at first, clinging to the old way of doing things. But over time, even the most skeptical of them couldn't deny life was easier under Caleb's leadership. The HOA had finally become what it was supposed to be, a service, not a dictatorship. But Caleb knew Margaret wasn't the type to disappear quietly. He wasn't surprised when he got a phone call one evening from an unknown number. "Richardson?" A familiar voice greeted him. "Margaret." Caleb leaned back in his chair, smirking. "To what do I owe the pleasure?" Margaret's voice was cold, but there was something new in it, defeat. "I see you've taken my old seat." Caleb didn't bother pretending. "I see you're still keeping tabs on the neighborhood you don't live in anymore." Margaret exhaled sharply. "Enjoy it while it lasts." Caleb chuckled. "Oh, I will. And don't worry, I won't make the same mistakes you did." There was a long pause, then Margaret spoke again, her voice quiet but laced with resentment. "You think you've won," she said, her words slow and deliberate. "But power changes people, Richardson. One day, you'll be the one they turn on." Caleb let her words settle, then simply smiled. "Then I guess I'll deal with that day when it comes," he said. "But unlike you, I won't spend my time looking over my shoulder." There was silence on the other end before the line went dead. Margaret was gone. And for the first time, Caleb knew she wasn't coming back. Months later, Caleb sat on his porch watching the sun dip behind the rooftops. The neighborhood had changed, but so had he. He had stepped into a war, fought back, and came out on top. He hadn't just won, he had reshaped the rules of the game itself. As he took a sip of his beer, he thought about what Margaret had said. Power changes people. Maybe that was true. But the real difference, he wasn't afraid of change. Because the moment you start fearing the world around you, you've already lost control. And Caleb Richardson, he had no intention of losing again.